right, here we are. My name is Dan Pierce, and welcome to the Heartwood stream series. We are streaming live from Vancouver, BC, in the traditional unceded territories of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. And this is the fourth edition of the Heartwood stream series. So please go back and check out some of those other episodes. We're managing to keep it going, so I'm really excited about that. I've got a really great show for you here today. Today I will be talking to Michelle Connolly, who is the Director of Conservation North. She has a background in ecology and a wealth of experience in crafting and communicating conservation policy in BC, and we had a really great conversation all about the interior old growth forests, the pine beetle, climate change, and just everything forestry in BC, and I'm really excited to share that with you. Before we get to that though, I just want to get a few things out of the way. First of all, I am still running my Heartwood GoFundMe campaign. I am so close to my goal right now. I am less than $500 from reaching that 15,000 funding goal that I had set to produce a new series of webisodes all about logging in the interior of BC, which has its own suite of issues that people are facing in the interior that are unique and distinct from what's happening on the coast, where I've been focusing for quite some time. So I'm really excited to get this project off the ground, go and do some filming in October when the bulk of the filming is going to be taking place. But if you could help me get to that funding goal, I'm less than $500 away. I've posted the GoFundMe link in the comments. Every little bit counts, and you'll be helping to bring this really important series to life at a really urgent time for BC's forests. So check that out. Some other things coming up here that I'm excited to plug right now is that less than a week away, starting on September 10th and running to the 16th, is Forest March BC's online forest summit. I will also post the event and the website in the comments for that, but there's going to be, 5 or 6 straight days of just really fantastic speakers talking all about forestry issues in BC, not just about the problems, but also really digging into the solutions, and that is something that I'm really excited about as well. And to cap that off, on the 18th, on September 18th, is the BC Forest March, and that's going to be happening in towns and cities all across BC as well, Vancouver, Victoria, and check Facebook, check the Forest March BC website and see what other towns are organizing forest marches. And if there isn't one happening in your town, then reach out to them and maybe take that first step of organizing a forest march in your town and getting some people out. The more people we have marching across the province and making their voices heard, the harder it's going to be for John Horgan and the BC NDP government to ignore what's happening across the province and put their heads down and pretend like radical changes aren't necessary. We need to let them know what's what. We need to let them know what we want. We need to let them know that we're paying attention and that they will be held accountable if they don't take us seriously. But that all being said, I think that's about all I wanted to say before we get into this interview. It was a fantastic conversation, and I'm excited to share it with you all. And I'll come back at the end of the interview and just, say a few more words. But for now, let's get to it. Here is my interview with Michelle Connolly. All right, Michelle Connolly, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. All right, so why don't you just start by introducing yourself a little bit. Tell me a little bit about your background growing up in BC and what sparked your interest in forestry and forest ecology.
I grew up in Surrey, BC, and when I was there, the slogan for the place was the City of Parks, and it was full of natural places to explore. It's got another slogan now, which isn't very good, but the place has changed a lot. So when I was there, there was a really large bog nearby, and it had cranes and carnivorous plants in it, and there were bears in there as well. And I spent a lot of time outside.
Cool. And so tell me about how that kind of like led into an education into forestry and forest ecology. Tell me a little bit about the path that you went on and learning about forests, learning about the science of forests, but also actually getting into learning about forestry itself.
Yeah, I took a few courses at SFU between working and then started at UBC Forestry as a mature student. So my values were pretty well developed going into it. There were a few really great professors that were real beacons of light in a larger institutional culture that was mostly about figuring out ways to turn forests into money. People like Suzanne Simard, Michael Feller, Paul Wood, Ken Lertzman, who's at SFU. And I'm really grateful for those people because they provided kind of an alternative viewpoint that I really appreciate. There was there's a fellow named C.S. Halling whose work is really relevant to forestry, and I recall encountering his writing on my own. He wrote a paper called Command and Control and the Pathology of Natural Resource Management. And in that paper, he explains that natural resource management has been an effort to create order and predictability out of complex natural systems for short-term economic benefit. And he pointed out that command and control management doesn't really work because it almost always results in kind of unforeseen and undesirable consequences. And you can see examples of what he talked about pretty much everywhere in our industrialized landscapes. But in forests, some examples of command and control are things like the suppression of fire in fire-prone forests, the conversion of old growth to production or plantations, the use of herbicides to kill anything that isn't a conifer, mechanical site preparation, where you try to change a place like a wetland into a place that you can grow trees. And these things are all really common practice. So the culture of modern forestry it's all about command and control of nature. And in my personal opinion, there's a lot of arrogance and a lack of humility in that culture in general. But as I said, I kind of came to the School of Forestry prepared for that a little bit.
I want to stay on this thread of forestry education because I think almost every forester in the province, either went through the UBC forestry school or some other similar kind of forestry school. And you kind of got an inside look at what that education process is like. So can you give us that inside scoop on like what is the indoctrination process that goes that is sort of like training foresters today, and what was it like for you as someone who had who'd kind of already developed your values, who believes in science and ecology, and who was not necessarily on board with this kind of with this industrial model of harvesting forests? Tell me a little bit about that experience, what you saw, and what it was like for you.
Well, at the time, enrolling in forestry was how you got exposure to natural history, to ecology, and got to spend time outdoors learning. Whereas going into something like biology would have meant spending a lot of time staring into microscopes. So I think that's part of the appeal for a lot of people. I have a couple of silly stories about starting at UBC Forestry. In my first week of classes, we had this introductory course for the program I was in, and the first person invited to speak to us was a professor who famously really disliked environmentalists and environmental groups. And he spent the entire lecture doing this really fire and brimstone style sermon about how wrong they were, how misguided they were. And he had written a textbook about forestry that was used at UBC Forestry. And the first chapter had a section on what he called environmental religion or something to that effect, as if people who object to the liquidation of old forests, for example, were somehow, motivated by faith as opposed to something else. So he obviously really hated lay people who had an opinion about what was happening on the land. A close friend who did the same program as me, but finished a few years before me, their first guest lecturer was a person who was infamous for having started Greenpeace and then coming to his senses and working as a shill for industrial forestry throughout the 90s and onwards. And this person ran a forestry public relations outfit for years, and he even wrote a book about how great clear cuts were. And of course, when you're in school, it's really important to hear all viewpoints. But I can't help but think that putting these two in front of impressionable young people, at least most of the people in my class were young, right off the bat, was an attempt to kind of inculcate us into an industrial forestry mindset. I know a few people who never bought into any of it, got their degrees and ran away. But after saying all this, the current Dean of Forestry did a talk that's online. It's recorded. He did it at the Northwest Institute. So if you Google that, you can find the recording of it. And in his presentation, he actually says that we will never get primary forests back, and that we could do better with the forests that we've already converted and don't need to go into the remaining old growth and primary forests. So I guess it's still possible to be surprised by that institution. And I'd be surprised if he ever repeated that. But like I said, there's a recording for people that don't believe me.
Yeah, no institution is a monolith. I'm sure there's some different voices in there, but yeah, it's interesting to hear about sort of, what is generally getting communicated through, forestry schools. I remember seeing an email that was sent to my partner from a prof at UBC Forestry, and in the email signature of their email, it said, "Please print this email. Forests are a renewable resource." It is kind of the opposite of what people normally put in their email signatures, telling them not to print it.
Oh my goodness, that's funny.
But moving forward here, so once you were finished with your formal education, what were your next moves? Where did you go from there? How did you end up in Prince George, BC, starting this organization which you now run, called Conservation North? Give me that origin story if you don't mind.
A friend handed me a book while I was still in school. It was called Virtual Clearcut, and it was about Prince George. It was published in 2003. And specifically, it was about the Bowron Clearcut, which was created as a management response to a bark beetle outbreak that happened in the 1980s here. And at the time, it was one of the biggest clearcuts in Canada. I was working for years as a biologist, as a technician for various people, the provincial government, for an NGO. I worked for a museum for a while, and I realized pretty suddenly that I really needed to get out of the city permanently. And I started out being interested in the things that forestry characterizes as being bad, like fires, insects, and diseases, so things that are considered a nuisance for industrial forestry. And I'd spent a bit of time in the inland rainforest, and I was really interested in the ecological role of insects. So I looked into funding for research, and I contacted a professor at UNBC. And so I moved up here, and that was about 10 years ago. And my plan was to get enough education in this area to be scientifically literate, to be able to kind of understand the research in it. And so I did that. I don't have aspirations to be a researcher or an academic, and that so I achieved what I wanted to.
Great. Tell me a little bit more about Conservation North, your particular approach to campaigning for BC forests, some of the campaigns that you've got on the go, and yeah, just the work that you're doing at Conservation North.
We started Conservation North because we realized that there was a lot of concern in our community about the impact of industrial logging and roads on nature, but there was no one organizing people with those concerns or advocating. So we created the group to represent the constituency of people here who care about nature, and we're concerned about the loss of primary forests here, because forests are kind of the dominant ecosystem here. And it turns out that that's actually most of the people we encounter when we do outreach at public events or online. So getting our campaign off the ground was actually a lot easier than you might think it would be for a place that has been so controlled by industrial forestry interests. And I would probably chalk that up to the fact that people here have just had enough of industrial pillaging of the land. At least that's what we hear, even from people that had worked in forestry for many years. So loggers, truck drivers, retired Camp4 employees even. So Conservation North starts with a global perspective on the loss of biodiversity and on nature. We know that 82% of the world's forests are now degraded. So our position is that all primary forests should be left alone at this point, and that's informed by the scientific information on how much natural forest there is left, and the fact that BC's biodiversity is melting down. So industrial forestry should be restricted to areas already affected in the past, so previously logged areas. From our perspective, there's no such thing as sustainable management of primary or pre-contact forests. The only way to properly manage primary forests is to leave them alone. And this is sometimes an ideological barrier for people who are trapped inside forestry culture, because they sometimes believe that A, it's possible to manage nature, and B, that we ought to be doing that everywhere. As a group, we tend to avoid language that's operationally vague, like sustainable management, unless we're applying it to previously logged areas. We talk about forests as opposed to trees, because that's the scale at which things matter. We know that restoring old growth forests is basically impossible. And we never refer to nature as a resource in our own materials, because it reduces it to something that's there for humans to use, which we don't believe. So our group is run by volunteers. All of us do this in our spare time, and our funding comes from public donations.
Fantastic. Paint a picture of the forest landscape around where you live. For those of us who've never been there, I've driven through Prince George, but I've yet to kind of get out into the woods and really sort of like see the forest around the area where you live. And my uninformed picture of like kind of what I imagined in my mind was sort of a lot of lodgepole pine. But that's not the whole picture, right? Like you mentioned the inland rainforest. I think a lot of people would be surprised to know that there is actually like an inland rainforest that's very sort of akin to the coastal rainforest that we see out here on the coast. So if you wouldn't mind, just kind of like paint that picture for me of what the forests are like around Prince George and the diversity that exists there.
Yeah, the natural forests right around PG were dominated by kind of old white spruce forests, Douglas fir, and lodgepole pine. And I'm always thinking of the things that I can eat in forests. So you find a lot of black huckleberry, blueberries, high bush cranberries. Foraging is a really popular pastime here for things like mushrooms, and hunting and fishing are also really popular things to do. And of course, all those things can only come from forests that are basically left alone. So you mentioned that we've got inland rainforest here. So yeah, we have an inland rainforest and a boreal rainforest, and we sometimes call these areas the northern wet belt. So to get to the inland rainforest from here, you drive eastwards along Highway 16 until you start seeing red cedar and western hemlock. And that rainforest stretches from the headwaters of the Fraser River south into northern Idaho. So it follows the Rocky Mountain Trench. It's very lush. It's very rich in species of lichens and plants of all kinds. And in recent years, scientists have discovered new kinds of plants in there. It gets deep winter snow, so it's really beautiful for snowshoeing in the winter. And there are springs and seepage areas that support really old cedar stands. And if you drive north of town, you enter an area that we've been calling the boreal rainforest, which is dominated by old spruce and subalpine fir. And it stretches north from the inland rainforest into the Peace River watershed. And that landscape is a lot of rolling mountains, and it has a different feel from the inland rainforest. It's got different smells. And when you walk into boreal rainforest, the trees are really tall and straight, and it's darker. There are sturgeon and salmon in the Fraser River, and bull trout and grayling in the rivers north of here in the boreal rainforest. And one of the things that is pretty special to us as a group is that, pretty unbelievably, actually, we still have all the pre-contact large-bodied animals in this region. So grizzly bear, wolf, wolverine, cougar, diversity of birds, bats, and of course many food plants and medicines. One thing that's really important to mention about our wet belt forests is that because of the topography and the climate here, it's unlike other places in the interior that burn regularly. So fires here are really infrequent. They don't spread very far when they do happen. And instead, the disturbances here that are really important are things like insects. So things that eat needles and leaves, ones that burrow into bark, fungi that cause decay in roots and stems. And of course, we get windstorms here that blow trees down, and lightning storms that cause small fires. And these are elements that create complexity in our forests, and they're very important. And yeah.
Yeah, and can you touch on the state of old growth around where you are, and primary forests, and again, when people think about old growth, I think a lot of people think about the coast. They think about Clayoquot Sound, they think about Vancouver Island. They don't necessarily think about the interior. What's the picture of old growth, original forests, primary forests around where you live and in the interior of BC?
Yeah, so I'm most familiar with what's around here. In this region, there's been logging since the 1900s to feed at one point hundreds of sawmills, and so they were targeting the oldest, biggest trees. There's been industrial scale logging, so large scale market orientated logging that uses heavy machinery. That's been going on here for about 60 years. In the 1960s, the pulp mill went up, and that just became a vacuum. So it created the clear-cut logging phenomenon, and not much has changed here since then, except that there are a couple of new threats that I can talk about. But all of that logging has really gone after the oldest, biggest trees because they're just the most efficient. They're the easiest to access, in the lower elevation areas along the rivers. And so all that historical logging and modern logging has gone after the biggest, oldest forests. So as you mentioned, people sometimes don't think that we have old growth forests in the interior. But we do, and right now, after about 100 years of industrial logging of it, it's a lot less frequent on the landscape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there was a bombshell study that was released earlier this year, it was independently published by Karen Price, Rachel Holt, and Dave Doust, called Last Stand for Biodiversity. And this report laid out like the dire circumstances for old growth in BC, stating that there's less than 3% of the sort of highest value or highest productivity old growth forests in the province remaining today. And of course, this is putting all kinds of species and just the ecological health of the forest in peril. So what's your reaction to these numbers? What was your reaction to this report? And maybe you could just lay out some of the biggest takeaways from the Last Stand for Biodiversity report.
Yeah, the scientists' report is a snapshot of the current state of old growth forests in BC. And it's so valuable to us because it puts numbers to what many people in our region have been observing but hadn't really empirically verified. So up until pretty much now, productive old growth is what's most threatened everywhere in BC. So that's where most of the loggings happen because it's the biggest and easiest to access trees, like I mentioned. These are in the lower elevation areas, the flat areas. Productive old growth, so the places that grow the biggest and fattest trees, was pretty naturally rare to begin with, and now it's extremely rare because of the history of logging here. And the scientists' report calls for an immediate moratorium on logging in areas that you can see in their map in the report. They're red zones. So it specifically mentions our local wet belt forests as falling into those red zones. Our region is basically one giant red zone. And of course, the first step to doing this is to identify exactly where the remaining productive old growth is spatially. And the next step is to put an immediate moratorium on logging those areas now. One thing I learned recently is that the province does not monitor the amount of old growth on the landscape. In the Prince George timber supply area here, that job, believe it or not, is left to a group of licensees. It's left to Canfor. And it should be, pretty clear why that's a huge problem. So one of the things that came out in this report that the scientists explain is that the best benchmark for knowing what is an appropriate amount of old forest in a landscape is to look at what proportion of the landscape was naturally old before the advent of industrial logging. In the wet belt, that would have been between 70 or 80% of the landscape. It depends on where you draw the boundaries, of course, but our forests are way below that now. And it's a problem because our wildlife evolved with forests that were mostly old. And when you change that age structure, you reduce the you reduce biodiversity, you reduce the resilience of these places. And that was one of the important findings of this report, is that that's what's happening here. So the report made it abundantly clear that forest policy in BC has failed wildlife, it's failed biodiversity, it's failed our forests. And now industrial forestry interests are trying to secure exclusive logging zones to guarantee access to these last places that were identified in the report as being essential to biodiversity. And right now, the BC government is granting licenses to log to pellet companies in forests where the traditional players, so the companies that go after saw logs, for example, weren't interested in. So, so the report presented this issue of productive forests, which are the ones that are the most at risk, and now we're finding that because those are in such short supply, the other types of forests are now on the chopping block, basically.
Mm-hmm. One of the most, or one of the interesting things that I took away from the report and what the report did was it put the lie to the numbers that the government had been leaning on and that industry had been pointing to sort of make their counter argument that, what are you talking about? There's tons of old growth. And what the report revealed is that what they had been doing to inflate their numbers was lumping in that low productivity old growth, like, high alpine old growth and, stunted bog swamps, to sort of pump up the numbers, when really, what environmentalists are concerned about, what scientists are concerned about, and what industry is most interested in is, of course, that high productivity old growth. And it's that old growth that's most threatened and most endangered at this point. I thought that was a really fascinating sort of takeaway from that piece as well.
Yeah. From our perspective, every square meter of what's left of nature at this point in BC is really important to protect. And I agree that that manipulation of information is a really common theme in what comes out of the forest industry, what you see on the BC government website. That's a huge problem. The manipulation of public perception and the misuse of information to spread information that's not accurate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And one of the points made the title of the report is Last Stand for Biodiversity. So really, as a result of this loss of old growth, what we're also losing is species. And of course, there's, it was something like over 1,000 species that could go extinct in the near future in BC. And one of those species that have been most imperiled by the loss of old growth in the interior is the iconic mountain caribou. So for those who are unaware, give us a sense of the challenges facing caribou in BC, the root causes of their decline, and if you can also, if there are any other species that we should be aware of that are really feeling the impacts of this loss of old growth.
Yeah, so deep snow mountain caribou are old growth dependent, and they're endemic to BC, and they rely on interior rainforests. So they depend on old growth forest for foraging and for avoiding predators. They eat hair lichens in the forest canopy by walking on top of winter snowpack. And those lichens can take centuries to establish and grow to volumes that are capable of feeding them during harsh winters here. Another species I recently discovered that is in big trouble is fisher, which have just been put on the provincial blue list, which is just a list. It doesn't trigger any protection. So fisher are a medium-sized weasel, so they're a carnivore. And also their smaller counterpart, martens, are apparently also plummeting. And those are probably not the only things in this area. I'm sure there are other things that we either, I heard a wildlife biologists say that most of the things that we're bothering to measure are in decline, which is terrifying. But habitat loss is at the root of all those declines.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? So habitat loss, like what does that mean? What is it that that say a species like caribou is losing? You know, that when it doesn't have old growth, is it sort of food, shelter? Is it all of the above? You know, and maybe you could. And another thing that I've heard is that. You know, with all the sort of roads that we're building, it's creating easier access for predators to be able to hunt not just caribou, but moose and deer, and they're following the moose and they're kind of getting caribou as bycatch. So maybe I guess what I'm getting at here is if you could just elaborate a little bit more on the mechanics of like what is it that is like creating this crunch for caribou, or creating such difficult circumstances for caribou to survive.
Yeah. Okay. So it seems like one of the main ways in which the BC government has been addressing the fact that caribou are in decline has been the wolf call, and there's a pretty good analogy to kind of describe why that isn't working for them. And the way I would describe it is to imagine that we're in a boat and the boat scrapes a rock and it gets a really big tear in the hull and it's taking on water. So what's the first thing you do in a situation like that? You get your baler out and you start scooping water out with your baler. But baling is not going to solve the problem of the tear. It's just going to buy us a bit of time. And so killing wolves is like bailing out your boat. So that the time it buys us needs to be spent fixing the actual problem, which is that we're losing caribou habitat. So we have to stop logging the habitat. And you know, as I heard someone say, it's really childish to pretend otherwise. And I think it brings up a really important distinction between the proximate and ultimate causes of extinction of species. So a fellow named Graham Connolly wrote a paper calling attention to the need to manage the ultimate causes of species extinction. So if you focus only on the proximate cause, you're going to be bailing a boat until it sinks. And right now we're bailing the boat and there's still a huge tear in the hull that we refuse to repair. We're just ignoring the tear in the hull. So wolves are not the actual problem. It's the fact that caribou have nowhere to actually live anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just to keep rolling forward here, so you talked a little bit before about one of the issues that has been most prevalent in the area where you live has been pests, and of course the mountain pine beetle was a total disaster for the interior. You know, sort of rolled across the province, and my understanding is that it wiped out, you know, upwards of 50% of the pine forests in the interior. So tell me what it was like for you. Like, you were living up there, you were looking out at the landscape. Like, describe what that was like. Tell me about that outbreak, and, you know, what caused it and what we learned from it. And yeah, let's just start with that.
Sure. So I'll start by saying that when I moved up here to you know, do research, I deliberately ignored the pine beetle thing because I was just so sick of hearing about it and, you know, listening to people talk about it and just witnessing all the drama around it. So I'm a little bit biased, but what I can talk about is because I think this is because I'm a disturbance, like my background's in disturbance ecology, so I see things a little differently. Mm-hmm. And you posted an article on the Heartwood documentary website yesterday that was really interesting because it was a perfect example of the kind of manipulation of language and information to make it seem like natural disturbances are the problem. So to start, insect outbreaks like the pine beetle don't wipe out forests like that. That's that's the first thing that I would say. They kill a lot of trees sometimes, but outbreaks are actually normal. And we will probably get them maybe more often and more severe in the future because of the way the climate's changing. In the ecosystems of our focus area, insect outbreaks create complexity, they create heterogeneity in forests. And old growth forests actually owe their structure and complexity to the natural workings of insects here. So the inland rainforest and the boreal rainforest. Areas that have been disturbed by fires or insects, or both, provide habitat that is totally absent in an industrialized landscape like a plantation, a managed forest. So we need to protect naturally disturbed landscapes. We need to protect places that have been hit by beetles, fire, all that. Insect outbreaks generally happen really gradually. So they open up the forest canopy to light. There's always some living trees. The forest floor usually stays intact, but sometimes you get trees tipping over and then new spots for trees to establish. If it's a defoliating insect, so an insect that eats the needles or leaves, they poop out available nutrients that feeds new trees and growth. And if you contrast that with logging, it's sudden, it's violent, and what keeps me up at night is thinking of what it must be like to be a bear in an area that's being logged, a nesting bird, and have your whole world crashing around you. So one of the most pernicious myths of modern forestry is that you can log your way out of an insect outbreak, and that's a lie. We can't actually control the antecedent conditions that promote episodic outbreaks of insects because they're climatically related. There's basically nothing we can do about that. And leading researchers, people like Diana Six, talk about it. A researcher at UNBC has written a book about this, Phil Burton. And what you'll hear from forest companies, from the district manager's office, and even some professional foresters, is that dead trees are wasted fiber. They use that word. And some biologists actually say that dead trees play an ecological role that is greater to or equal to their role as living trees. And Herb Hammond has said this before, a dead forest is still a forest.
Fascinating. Very different perspective on the pine beetle story that I don't think I've heard too often, and yeah, it definitely really gets framed as a disaster, and not enough attention is paid to the fact that it really is a part of nature. As you had, one of the things that you said there was that what we should really be doing is protecting these areas that have been affected by beetles so that they can go through their natural processes. Of course, this is not what the BC government and the industry did. They did try to log their way out of it, and one of the things that I learned about reading Andrew Nikiforik's book Empire of the Beetle is that they really kind of exacerbated the situation and created circumstances in which it was worse than it needed to be, in their efforts to try and salvage what kind of value they could from the trees that were on the landscape. Are you able to speak to that at all? You're able to give me a sense of how, outside of the outbreak itself, how human activities, how industrial activity sort of made that situation worse than it needed to be?
I think what I would say is that the only kind of defense for doing it is for money. And if you're someone that reads information and sees that kind of messaging, just know that what they're trying to do is prop up an argument to justify logging. And when what it's there's nothing wrong with saying we need the money and so we're going to log it now before the trees rot. Like then at least they're being honest. But I still see this this argument here and there, and it's getting to be a bit much.
Yeah, fair enough. All right. Well, moving forward here, now we're at a point now where the salvage operation from the pine beetle has kind of reached its conclusion. My understanding is that the government had kind of ramped up the AACs, the allowable annual cut, in order for the industry to be able to get those trees off the landscape. And now we're at a point where much of that is now gone, and we're seeing this sort of like this ramping down of the AAC, and along with that, we're seeing mill closures, job losses. Tell me, like, what's the picture? Give me a picture of what the sort of the economic state of the industry is around Prince George. What are you seeing there in terms of the state of the industry right now?
Well, I would start by saying that this reaction of using a disturbance to completely pillage an area has been in use for a really long time, and I've heard someone else say, we have a timber supply shortage because of 60 years of voracious industrial logging that's been driven by machines, and not because of fire and beetles. That's not true. So everything about the situation we are in was predictable, and it's reflective of a series of choices that were made by those in power. The whole logging after an insect is something we've seen before in our local forests, in our wet belt spruce forests here. I mentioned that book, Virtual Clearcut. So that book is about what happened in the 80s with the spruce beetle outbreak. At the height of the outbreak, there were hundreds of loaded trucks coming out of the Bowen Valley daily. So 15 million cubic meters is the number that I read, coming out in over 6 years of logging out that valley. They left absolutely nothing behind. There's a video that you can find online about what happened there. It was made in the 90s. And there's absolutely no way that 100% of those trees were killed by the spruce beetle. So this excuse to just to ramp up logging has happened before, and it's a consistent pattern, I think. About just the state of the industry, I think because the forests that can be turned into saw logs have been reduced to almost nothing by industrial forestry, the province and industry saw the writing on the wall, and they've now turned their attention to forests that wouldn't have been considered exploitable before. So they've turned their attention to natural forests in harder to access places with smaller trees. So the areas that you were saying before were, you were describing forests that were kind of lumped in to the bigger number to kind of exaggerate how much old forest there is. Well, now industry is targeting those places in the interior, so higher up, skinnier trees, harder to access. And so now the province has been issuing licenses to pellet companies to harvest primary forests, to harvest those places, because my understanding is that you can squish anything into a pellet, so it doesn't necessarily have to be the kind of wood that, say, you would build a house with. So our group has been doing some investigations in some of these areas that are being targeted by this new industry, and we're going to be releasing a video on it soon. It's kind of insidious because Clean BC, for example, which is the provincial government's plan to address climate change, refers to bioenergy from forests as clean and renewable fuels. And the fact is that if they're being sourced from primary forests, then they are absolutely none of those things. And so what's happening with Clean BC right now isn't about doing what's right by the climate. It's about trying to find new ways to address this problem that you've mentioned, finding new ways to exploit forests and trying to revive what's essentially a dying sector.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about climate change, which you just mentioned there. You know, you did suggest that that pine beetle outbreak, while a natural part of the ecology of the area, might have been made worse by climate change. The shorter, warmer winters means more beetles are living through the winter, creating a population increase. Of course, in 2017 and 2018, there were historic wildfires that happened across the province. And we're also now seeing flooding and drought conditions becoming more prevalent in different areas across BC. So maybe you could just pick up that thread and elaborate a little bit more on how climate change is affecting BC forests and how industrial logging is kind of compounding what's already happening as a result of climate change.
Sure. So you'll see three topics be bandied about in this whole discussion: fire, climate, and carbon. And they are things that are really interrelated. And there are some more kind of pernicious forestry myths relating to them. So the first one is that old growth is a fire risk, when in fact managed plantations and road density are actually the strongest correlates with forest fires. Old growth forests are the least probable areas to burn. Obviously, there's a range of predictions for how forests will respond to a warming climate, but some studies have shown that industrial logging can exacerbate fire risk and increase fire intensity, and that's because logging old growth changes the local microclimate and it changes fuel loads, so the things that, what fire eats up when it burns. The second myth that is discussed in this whole space of carbon management and climate change is that logging old growth is somehow a carbon management solution. There's no credible scientific argument for logging old growth to somehow conserve carbon. If we're concerned about addressing climate change, then protecting primary forests is actually one of the most obvious and easy ways to do it. Old growth both stores and sequesters carbon, so it holds it and it absorbs it. And there's a great deal of research on this. So old growth represents a legacy of carbon, which is held in the bodies of living trees and dead trees. It's held in the forest floor and in soils. And on the other hand, clear cuts continue to emit carbon dioxide for a decade after they've been logged, and often never recuperate their original carbon stores. So upwards of 40% of the carbon stored in old growth is just lost right away when you log it. So the way to deal with that is that wood must come from non-primary forests to be truly green. And protecting primary forests or pre-contact forests is essential for combating climate change, and it's one of the cheapest and most feasible climate solutions. But what we're seeing is that the logging industry needs to convince policymakers that destructive forestry practices are somehow beneficial to the global climate. So they spread misinformation, and of course these kinds of messages are very self-serving. So a really excellent report came out last month called The Logging Loophole, and it was put out by the Natural Resources Defense Council, and they wrote it about the boreal forest. So they're based back east. And so their focus was the boreal rainforest, but a lot of what's in there is totally applicable to here. And it sounds like the messaging we're hearing here is basically the same as the messaging that's coming from industry across Canada, which is that, we need to deal with fire and insects by logging. We need to convert our forests into, high value wood products like tables and chairs or something. And these issues are used to divert attention away from the controllable on the ground impacts of logging. So to actually scale back on logging and just log in different areas and not primary forests.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I want to actually that segues nicely into the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which is, forestry policy reform and what needs to be done there. Obviously, we can't keep doing what we're doing. It's clearly dysfunctional and destructive and not working and resulting in just ongoing degradation and decline, both ecological and economic. But at the same time, I don't think anyone is seriously saying we need to stop logging altogether, except for, of course, in those primary forests, which I totally agree with you. I think that, that needs to end. But in those, where logging is going to still occur, what needs to change in terms of how we log, where we log, and just like the laws around how forestry, how logging happens on the landscape?
Yeah, so I would say the first place to start is kind of looking at the good news and what and the bad news. So the good news is that natural forests, primary forests, old growth are complex and resilient, and healthy ecosystems bounce back from things like fire, insects, climate change. So that's the good news. We still have some of those forests around. The bad news is that modern forestry simplifies, degrades, or obliterates all that complexity. So the diversity of animals and plants that can live and survive in an industrial managed forest is a fraction of those that can survive in a natural forest, because they're no longer complex, they're no longer resilient to fire, and things like climate change. So the message of ecology is we need to keep those natural forests. And so all remaining primary forests should be no-go zones. Wood products must come from non-primary forests. It's not a green building if it comes from old growth. I learned recently from an expert in engineered wood products that the whole reason, he was from Germany, and he said that the whole reason that those innovations came about is because they ran out of old growth. So they were basically forced to do something with the trees they had. So these new wood products don't have to come from old growth. Pellets should most definitely not be coming from old growth. As I mentioned, there's licenses out there for them, and we're going to be talking about that at the BC Online Summit. I think you mentioned the word sustainable, and one thing that I always try to do when someone says that word is please define it, because to me, something is sustainable when you can do it forever without causing lasting or major harm to Mother Earth. Mining old growth is not sustainable. So yeah, to me, it doesn't matter if a corporation's doing it or a community forest is doing it. We just can't be doing it at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you believe that there is a way to practice forestry in a way in which respects nature, that works with nature, that could be done in a spirit of restoration, of actually helping to heal some of the damage that has been done over the years? And have you seen any examples in BC of exemplary forestry operations, whether it's woodlots or community forests? What's your take on that?
I would say that local control. So this is really what it comes down to. local control is always better, but I think we all need to recognize that in a globalized growth industrial economy, there is essentially infinite demand for the things that our forests are getting turned into. And that's because industrial capitalism basically converts nature into money. So I think we need localized systems that protect nature from the pressure that's created by this horrific system that we all live in that basically eats nature. Um, yeah, I um, I think when it comes to creating that system with local voices, I think there is lots of common ground among people within communities who want both nature and meaningful work, which I would argue is probably most people. Um, this was something we confronted when we weren't invited to the interior forestry renewal process. I don't know if you heard about that, but it was one of these engagement processes that the government set up last year.
Right.
And they, to start, they invited a really specific set of people to talk about what they think we should be doing. And I think that they asked all the wrong questions because they were all based around revitalizing a sector that's basically been driven into the ground. And the process just invited, the usual interests who are already kind of part of the problem. So the questions that should be or should have been, what are community needs and how do we meet those needs? If you ask those questions here, it would probably mean just doing less forestry and more local food production, for example. 96% of our food comes up the highway, which makes us really vulnerable as a region. I don't know anything about growing food, but there are people here with that knowledge. The climate envelopes are changing. We need to be finding things for younger people to do. And I think we should be asking the question to a broader cross-section of people than just the people that have been involved in industrial forestry forever. And honestly, they'll answer the questions a particular way because that's what they think about, and they're already kind of set up to understand that system. So they're just going to go with what's familiar. So I think we should be talking to a broader cross-section of people. I think we should just be doing something different. And I think we need to be building our economies based on protecting nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Especially with, climate change already here, we should be doing everything we can to, fortify ourselves and to really kind of hold on to what we have left and set ourselves up for not set ourselves up for disaster, but set ourselves up for success and renewal. But we're getting really close to the end here. Could you touch a little bit on this moment we're in right now? I don't know if you get this feeling, but I get this feeling that there's this kind of wave of energy that's really kind of spreading around the province right now. In the interior, I've been connecting more and more with these interior grassroots watershed alliances that are really trying to address their local watershed issues and that are connecting with each other and building solidarity. There's people on the coast, there's hunger strikers, there's the Fairy Creek blockade going on right now. There's these there's the old growth review that we're waiting on. There's this sense that the BC government might address forestry legislation in the near future, although I don't think anyone's holding their breath for them to do anything very meaningful. But do you feel that there's sort of like a wave of energy and interest right now in and attention being paid to forestry? And how can we ride this wave? How can we leverage this moment? What can we do right now to try and get some of these changes that we've been talking about and that are so badly needed?
Yeah, you mentioned the Fairy Creek blockaders, and my heart just swells when I think about what they're doing. I think we all should have the courage to to do what they're doing. The hunger strikers as well, they brought a lot of attention to this issue and are making people realize how serious it is. Honestly, the only real barrier we've come up against here isn't that people are opposed to protecting old growth, it's that they're not aware that it's being leveled at the moment. And so once we surpass that kind of critical level of knowledge, people are completely on our side. So, you know, I noticed you asked, when you interviewed Jen Houghton a couple weeks ago, that was a question for her, being in an interior community. And I thought that was funny because we don't have any difficulty bringing people over to our side here at all. And it might sound like I'm exaggerating, but I really am not. Like, we've been at this for 3 years, and we very rarely encounter people that say, no, protecting primary forests is a bad idea. That's actually just a latent feeling here. So I'm very hopeful when I see actions like the ones we're seeing on the coast. And I really, you know, I really get excited when I hear about other activists in the interior that are doing things. There's very much a divide between what happens in the interior and what happens on the coast. And I'm very worried that the BC government is going to treat us differently here than they do on the coast. And that makes me angry on many levels, because I feel like there's just a way that that the province patronizes people in the north and the interior. They kind of treat people here like we're rubes who only care about money and don't care about other things. And my experience living in this part of BC has really, you know, turned that into something that is not true at all. So so yeah, the real grassroots forest movement is coming from the interior now, and that's what we're seeing. That's what you're describing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm sort of at the end of my questions here. I just wanted to turn it to you. Is there anything else that you'd like to say before we wrap it up here to the public, or to Premier Horgan or Minister Donaldson? Anything else that you'd like to say here, Michelle Connolly?
Yeah, to the Premier, Minister Donaldson, you need to listen to us here in the Central Interior. Think about what communities actually need and not what the Kofi lobbyists are telling you. They do not represent us here. The popular consensus is that we need to protect our last old growth forests. And then to the people watching your live stream, the BC Forest Summit is going to be online from the 10th to the 15th, and there's some really interesting panelists. So folks should watch if they can.
Yeah, absolutely. And then on the 18th, I believe it is, there's the BC Forest March, which is going to be happening all across the province, in towns and cities all across the province. So yeah, also take a look at your local, just see if there's any local marches happening around you. And if there isn't, go to Forest March BC and maybe think about starting one, organizing one yourself, because yeah, the more places this happens across the province, the more publicity and attention it will draw. And that's exactly what we need right now. Michelle, thank you so much. I really appreciate you talking to me today. And yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Dan.
All right, and I'm back. Huge thanks to Michelle Connolly for talking to me. I thought it was a fantastic conversation. I learned a lot. I think the section on the pine beetle was particularly powerful for me, because I'd always kind of looked at it and thought of it as a disaster, which I think for economically, as well as how the situation was handled after the fact, to some extent it was a disaster, but to a larger extent it's important to recognize how pests, insects, these kinds of outbreaks and infestations are a natural part of the landscape, a natural part of the ecosystem, a natural mechanism of renewal in the forest. And while humans often find a way to frame something as a disaster so that they can get as much, cash in any way they can in that moment of chaos and that moment of uncertainty, which certainly the forest industry did. It definitely changed my perspective a little bit on that pine beetle situation. And another interesting point about how really, beetles and fire are a natural part of the landscape. The industry isn't in an economic state of decline because of beetles and wildfire. Those things should have been anticipated. It's the century of industrial logging with heavy machinery that has really kind of set the industry on this trajectory of decline that it's been on for quite some time. The last thing I want to say here is at the end of our interview there, I mentioned the Fairy Creek blockade, and when we recorded this interview, that was on Tuesday, and that was before, in the last few days, some controversy has emerged on Facebook around the Fairy Creek blockade, and some Indigenous leaders have flagged that some of the blockaders in Fairy Creek may not be following proper protocols with regards to obtaining the necessary consent to be holding a blockade on Pacheedaht territory. And it's been an interesting couple of days reading through all the comments, watching the debate unfold online. I didn't really say anything yet because I'm not one to sort of leap into a Facebook debate in a sort of knee-jerk fashion. And, as a settler, I felt like it was really important for me to just kind of like learn and listen and really try and absorb and understand the concerns that have been raised, the legitimate concerns that have been raised by some Indigenous activists. And I just wanted to thank them for, bringing these things to, into the public realm so that we can have this debate. And it's important that we listen and learn and go and do these kinds of things in the right way. And I'm definitely going to be trying to have some conversations over the next little while with Indigenous people and with people involved in this conversation, about what is the right way to have a blockade on Indigenous territories for settlers who care about ecology, who care about protecting old growth, and who also care deeply about Indigenous sovereignty. What are the right ways to go about these things? And also, what are the right ways to respond when these kinds of concerns are raised? I think it's important to listen, to not get defensive, to not try and push back, but to try and learn and maybe take a new approach and adopt some of the recommendations that have been brought into play. So that being said, I really hope that the two sides in this debate, I'm sorry to create a division like that, but it does seem that some people have staked out their camp on one side, some have staked out their camp on the other side. And I really hope that, that the settlers and whoever's pushing back against this takes this as an opportunity to learn, to listen, and to do things better. And I also hope that the whole group is able, that those of us who care about nature, that care about Indigenous sovereignty, are able to sort of mend whatever sort of rift may have emerged here and come back together and realize that we are all on the same side and that we do care about the same things. And and in this very stream series, I look forward to continuing this conversation and bringing in some Indigenous voices to talk to me about these issues. So that's about all I have for you today. I thank you again to Michelle Connolly. I thought that was an incredibly fascinating conversation. I learned a lot. I hope that you all took something away from it as well. Just one more reminder, I am still running my GoFundMe campaign right now. The link is in the comments. I'll post it again. I am less than $500 away from my goal, my funding goal. So if you can help me get there, every little bit helps, and it will help me to produce this these new series of webisodes that I'm going to be producing all about logging and forests in the interior of the province, and trying to shine a light on some of the interior forestry issues that are going on that are distinct from the coast, but also trying to build those connections and build more communication and dialogue between what's happening on the coast and what's happening in the interior. There's a ton of overlap, and we have a lot of common ground, and so I hope that we can all start to unite and collaborate and organize and work together and speak with one voice and become a united front for the kinds of forestry changes that I think many of us agree are super necessary and urgent right now, like bringing an end to old growth logging, just leaving whatever's left of our natural forests alone, shifting the industry to an ecologically based, community-oriented, second and third growth, value-added forestry model that prioritizes clean water, ecological health, community health, and restores power back to the Indigenous communities, First Nations, and rural communities that actually live with these forests and are best positioned to make decisions about this forest. And if you're interested in continuing this conversation, next week, starting on September 10th, is the Forest March BC online forest summit, or online forest convergence. I'll post all the information for this, but it's going to be 5 straight days of fantastic conversations with all manner of experts in forestry and forests, forest ecology. So that's going to be fascinating. Tune into that. And lastly, on the week after that, the 18th of September is the BC Forest March happening across BC. There's definitely marches happening in Vancouver and Victoria, but go to forestmarchbc.ca, or it might be forestmarchbc.com. I will post that link in the comments just to be sure, and see if there's a march happening near you. And if there isn't, reach out to them, maybe organize one yourself. The more people who are marching across the province, the harder it's going to be for Horgan and Donaldson and the BC government to ignore these calls for change. So that's all for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. This was my first time trying to stream to multiple channels. So we've been streaming not just on Facebook Live, but also on YouTube and Twitch. So I don't know if anyone watched it there, but got to start somewhere. And I really appreciate you joining me for this edition of the Heartwood Stream Series. I'm going to take a break next week and create space for this online forest summit, and maybe I can find a way that I can sort of also stream it on my Facebook page. So anyway, that's it. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend. I'm Dan Pierce, and I'm out.